Welcome to the Equals Assessment webinar, Part 2. In this webinar, we will look at the following aspects of the Equals Assessment: placing students in Equals. We'll examine assessment materials. We'll take a look at the assessment subtests, and then distinguish between typical and adapted assessment items. You can place a student in Equals in a number of ways. For example, if a student has had no or little math instruction, begin in Chapter 1, Lesson 1. If that is appropriate, then it's absolutely fine to just start at the beginning. However, as you know, Lesson 1 in Chapter 1 assumes that the student has had very little math. You can look at all of the lesson objectives from chapters 1 to 12 at the beginning of the overview and make your best guess as to where to begin. Then move forward with the lessons in order from that place. You could make your best guess, begin to teach, and then begin assessing your students one at a time and adjust the chapter and groupings as needed. Or for some teachers, they prefer to begin with the assessment and determine the appropriate placement in that way. Remember that sometimes district guidelines will dictate where you begin in your assessment. Any of these methods for determining how to place your students in Equals are used by teachers. So let's talk for a moment about the difference between the Equals assessment and an inventory. An inventory or checklist is something that you may have completed for your students with special needs in the past. And my experience has been that an inventory requires that the person completing it actually guess about how the student will do on a particular skill. Whereas the Equals assessment gives students a chance to actually demonstrate each item so you can see for yourself what they know, even if it's a portion of a concept or skill. You will have the handout entitled How to Begin with Equals. On the left side, there is a brief summary on how to assess. You'll find the full description of the assessment in the Equals Overview Guide. You will need the following materials to administer assessments: a student response booklet, or a student protocol as it is sometimes called, 2 flip books, materials you print from the CD, materials from the Equals Manipulatives Kit, and then some additional materials from your classroom, just some common classroom items. All of the materials that you require for each subtest are listed in the flipbook. I'm going to show you a really effective way to organize these materials ahead of time to make your administration more efficient. This is what the flipbook looks like. On one side, there are instructions for the teacher, and the other side shows the area where the students need to reference for the item. This is the student response booklet. You will use this booklet while you are administrating each assessment. On it, you will complete information about each student. You can fill in detailed information about their attention and engagement, their activity, any adaptations required or access issues. And then each of the subtests are listed here, and you will record how your student does. You'll notice there is a column with the letter A above it. If you give the student the adapted test item, you will check that off. We'll talk a little bit more about scoring in the next webinar. At the end of the student response booklet, you'll find pages where the student may need to write for specific test items. Those items are clearly marked in the flipbook. So there are 6 subtests contained in the equals assessment, and each of the subtests reflects the 6 content areas, and they are attending and exploring, patterns in algebra, data analysis and probability, geometry, measurement, numbers, and operation. It's up to you which subtest you'd like to begin with. You can present them in any order. However, once you begin a subtest, you must follow the items within a subtest in order. And then there are materials required for the assessment that I mentioned. There are typical materials and adapted materials. So for example, at the beginning of the Patterns in Algebra subtest in the flipbook, you'll find a list of materials required in order for you to administer this assessment. The first list of materials are typical materials. So these are materials that the student who requires no adaptations, who is going to do all typical items, will be able to use. If you have a student that requires some adaptations due to motor issues, communication struggles, there are a variety of reasons that we might provide adaptations, then you will want to have these materials on hand. Again, I'm going to share with you a really effective way to keep track of these materials. And then in the assessment, there are typical items and adapted items. The items refer to the test questions. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. When you are giving the assessment, on the flipbook you'll notice the first item contains the question. This is the typical item. Then there's a space, and then an adaptation is provided. When you give a typical item, you are assessing full understanding of the concept. When you give the adapted item, you are giving the student all due opportunity to show what he or she knows, perhaps a portion of the concept. There will be a half credit given for adapted items. Now, you can give all typical items, or you can give all adapted items, or you can give any combination. You do not have to give the typical item before the adapted item, but you can. Make sure that you mark 1 for a correct typical item, 0 for incorrect, and then mark the adapted box if you gave the adapted item on the student response booklet. I'll talk to you about how you will determine half points at another time. Now, we don't want to confuse adapted items with accommodations. For example, using an AAC device to give a verbal answer, as long as this is the student's primary and independent means of communicating, and you have given the typical item, would count as a typical item. So as long as the accommodation you give does not interfere with the student's ability to demonstrate full understanding of that typical item, it would not be considered an adaptation. Let's look at some examples to help understand that better. Here's an example of an item from the Patterns in Algebra subtest. The typical item reads, show and read AB pattern with red and green paper tiles. Read the pattern. So the teacher would read red tile, green tile, red tile, green tile, and then ask the question, how many units in the pattern? The student completing the typical item would say 2 units, or the number 2. If they needed to use an AAC device to communicate that, that would be completely appropriate and would be considered an accommodation. Here's the example of the same item but with the adaptation. So in this case, you are asked to show and read the AB pattern with red and green cubes. So I would say red cube, green cube, red cube, green cube. And then I would ask the students, show the units in the pattern. And then I would show the student 3 choices: a red and green cube, a green cube, and a butterfly. And the student would point or gaze or touch the appropriate choice. So in this case, the student is showing understanding of a portion of this concept. Let's look at an example from the numbers and operations subtest. The typical item tells the teacher to point to the number 12 and then say to the student, say the name of the numeral. And the student would need to indicate 12. The adaptation goes like this. I would say to the student, show 12, and then I would move the counting window over the choices until the student indicates an answer. Here's an example from the geometry subtest. In this case, the student will need the student response booklet. So you point to the area on the student response booklet, and the student is asked, show the rectangle and draw it. So there are 3 shapes here for the student to select and then trace. The adaptation reads, here's a closer look at it. The adaptation reads, you're going to show long angle legs. These are manipulatives from the manipulatives kit, and short angle legs, and an insect in the pocket chart. And you're going to ask the student to make a rectangle. So the student will choose the sides that are required to make a rectangle one at a time. If they are able to choose 2 longs and 2 shorts, they have demonstrated an understanding of a rectangle. Here's an example from the data analysis and probability subtest. The typical item reads, show the tally chart in the student response booklet. So this is in the student response booklet. Read the row and column headings. Then say, tally the food boys and girls like. And then read one name at a time and wait for the student to tally. If necessary, you can tell if the name refers to a boy or a girl. With the adaptation, you would do it a little bit differently. In this case, you would show and read the tally chart from the student response booklet, but this time you'll say, I will tally the number of boys and girls who like pizza. Then you'll point to the assessment book chart and point and say, Tawny likes pizza. Show the one to tally. Now you'll go over to the pocket chart and you'll read the 3 choices: a bird, a girl, or a boy. So the student would indicate whether Tawny is a bird, a girl, or a boy. And then the teacher will mark that in the tally chart. You would continue this for the remaining boys and girls. Here's another example from the numbers and operations subtest. You would ask the student about how many candies in the hand, about how many candies in the bag. The first answer the student gives must be about 5, and the second answer must be between 20 and 50. The student must answer 2 out of 2 questions. The adaptation reads like this. Show about how many candies in the hand, and then the teacher will show them 3 choices: 4 marked on a 10 frame, 3 10 frames, and a 100 frame. Then you'll ask about how many candies in the bag. Again, the 3 choices are shown to the student. The student must answer 1 out of 2 correctly. So again, in the adaptation, the student is showing understanding of a portion of the concept. So those are a few examples of typical items and adapted items that are available in the assessment. And as I stated earlier, it's up to you to decide if you want to try the typical item first and then offer the adapted item, or if you know your student well, do only the typical item or only the adapted item. When you're ready, move on to the Equals Assessment webinar.